Well, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Padraig Stapleton, VP of Engineering for ZEDEDA, and I'm very glad to be joined by a number of folks today who are very knowledgeable experts in this field of edge computing, and particularly around the topic we're going to discuss, which is architecture for successful use for edge. So before we start into the topics themselves, I just want to do a quick roundtable, let people introduce themselves, and so you get a little bit of context and understand the background. So Lakshmi, we're going to start with you. Lakshmi Sharma from Google, Director of Product Management. You want to just give a quick overview, quick explanation of your background and area of expertise?
Yep, I'm Lakshmi Sharma, currently running networking product management at Google Cloud, and with Google for close to 4 years now. With regards to edge and networking, my 20 plus years of my experience in engineering, product management, business has been in infrastructure and primarily in networking and compute and networking has converged over years. So very familiar with enterprise space, telco space, and what the transformation has been all the way from boxes to virtual to NFV to cloud to edges. Have also spent time in retail side. I was vice president for infrastructure and cloud at Target. So I personally kind of lived the journey of what happens when a digital transformation happens and migration to cloud. So looking forward to this panel.
Great, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Next, Dan, who's CTO for the Edge Computing Group within Dell. Dan?
Thank you, Padraig. Thank you for having me. Dan Cummins, Dell Technologies Fellow. I've been with Dell and prior EMC since 2010, got 30 plus years of embedded systems development and systems design experience. Most recently, delivering the modernization of our mid-range storage offering in Dell. Recently moved over to Edge to help shape and define a technical strategy for how Dell wins at the edge.
Great, thanks Dan, thanks for joining us. VK, Shankar from Intel.
Hi. Thanks, Padraig. Yes, VK Shankar from Intel Corporation. I'm part of the IoT group, IoTG at Intel. I'm the director and principal engineer for Industrial Edge Computing. About 23 years of total industry experience, of which 20 years I've been at Intel, started my career with Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC. But of late, I've been focused on IoT and the whole transformation to edge-based technologies that are relevant for appropriate segments in IoT.
Great. Thanks for joining us, VK. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And finally, Clint Chapman from Agora. Clint, you're IoT Solutions Architect?
Yes. So my name is Clint Chapman, so thanks for letting me be on the panel. So my background, let's say I have 24 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, coming from Schlumberger, and Agora is a Schlumberger venture where I'm doing IoT solutions for it. So I've done, say, consider development, project management, a lot of architecture over the last 15 years or so. And really excited about that, and participate in other industry groups like OSDU and open groups and things like that to help guide the industry on where they're headed in terms of drilling and oil and gas connectivity and communications.
Great. All right. Thanks, Clint, for joining us. So I think the great thing about this panel, from my perspective, is that there's a great variety here of people, backgrounds, everything from retail to device hardware, through PCs, through oil and gas, right? It's a very diverse group, a very diverse experience. So as we think about architecting for edge and successful deployment at edge, right? What are the best practices, right? And I mean, it's a really interesting problem because edge environments are diverse. They're everything from oil wells, retail stores, to a Formula One car, Lewis Hamilton's driving for Mercedes-Benz, right? They're the architecture. How do we accommodate all these different types of scenarios with different needs for compute, storage, transfer, etc.? Dan, what's your thoughts on what are the things we need to focus on, best practices for deployment of edge?
So our view at Dell is, we quickly came to realize that you can't apply IT practices to an OT world. So if you think about the massive scalability of all this data being generated at the edge, there's according to industry research, by 2025, 7% of the world's enterprise generated data is going to happen outside the core data center or cloud at the edge, right? So the massive expansion and the generation of all this IoT streaming data, you need to understand that edge computing devices, the frameworks, and where they exist and who can operate on them is different than what's IT. You could have, kind of a remote site that's unmanned, or you could have a site that needs to be serviced by somebody who's only trained in the safety and security protocols, of that environment, right? So we have to think differently to both manage at scale, understand, who can qualify and work in these locations, how you service the locations, and it pretty much needs to be hands off or with somebody who has little to no IT experience, right? And then layered on top of all of that has to be end-to-end security. So that's just one area, but there's other areas as well, and I guess we'll let the other panelists talk about those.
So Clinton, just leading off that, I mean, so you're obviously in a space that has safety kind of issues, has a very tough environment. What kind of things do you think about when you're trying to create solutions that are going to operate successfully in those?
Yeah, I think there's, a lot of things that Daniel talked about. The operationalization of the system is really a big deal that you got to think of up front. It's getting to be now that the the development of the containers and the pushing of the containers and what the device is doing is actually becoming sort of the easy part of the problem. I would say it's probably maybe 20% of the problem. The difficult portions now seem to be more related to how am I going to operationalize it? How am I going to get how am I going to keep it running, keep it safe, keep somebody from stealing the antennas off the box, those things like that, and then get it, and managing, where you're going to be deploying it. That's particularly in an oil and gas situation where the assets are very valuable and you're working in harsh environments, which can be environmentally harsh or just it's a dangerous environment, that type of thing. So you get into the same types of situations. Do you have qualified individuals that can go out to the jungle and install one of these devices, get it running, and get it communicating back to the system? I mean, back to some sort of operational headquarters. Another aspect of it is to really consider how you're going to move the data. So when you're talking worldwide deployments and you're saying you're trying to create an IoT platform that can service them all, you get to, is it cloud, is it private cloud, is it on-prem, or using IoT devices in a completely disconnected state that it's not IoT, but you're using it, the IoT hardware, and then trying to manage it in the field by somebody traveling place to place to place. So that's becoming a really difficult thing. One of the real nice best practices I think we're going to start seeing coming more and more is that they is sort of reference architectures for the edge. Yeah, and I think that's going to be more and more prolific. That basically, having everything's containers, running on there. Some sort of Linux environment. Hypervisor is going to be out there. It's going to be messaging with services on the edge. So it's how you kind of deploy the containers. And then you get to the management of them, which becomes more and more difficult. So I'll stop there to give some other people so I won't steal everybody's thunders.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think what you bring up an interesting point is how we're going to manage, right? And you talk about containers, and I think we also see a lot of interest around Kubernetes. I think Lakshmi, from obviously Kubernetes and Google are synonymous, right? How do you guys see this type of technology moving out to the edge?
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of hear both the perspectives. So from a cloud perspective, like we were, since we had been already deploying at edges, right? The cloud, at least Google Cloud, the way it was designed was always because of the fact that we leverage what we already have from Google, which was really a distributed system, gigantic global system. We had various forms and factors of technologies already deployed at edges, right? There were different kinds of POPs and edges and sites and data centers of various form factors that later on became standardized in terms of, I would say, nomenclature and taxonomy, but we had been doing. And while, it's great to kind of hear, Clinton, your perspective, which is kind of from an application perspective, because you are coming from an application view. You have a workload which sits in some, say, deep, secure places or, say, difficult places. Then in order to build an application like that, yes, absolutely. I think it makes sense to go to the lowest common denominator of building that application that a developer could do, which is really kind of coming from a container world. Makes sense. And again, but that's I would say this is application developer view of what application do you want to deploy. So it's absolutely one technology when you're thinking from a fast to say deployment capability, which is container on a small form factor of devices, a small form factor of platforms. But at the same time, like when we think about this, is kind of one use case. But when you're taking it to, I put that into a more secure and a more complex kind of environment. But second is where your decision to make or time to decision is also very important, like, which you kind of alluded to earlier, which was kind of autonomous car, right? Then you have a combination, right? Because then there are certain applications you would rely to be maybe bare metal, but the most important would be that how fast do you reach that place, right? When it goes to kind of lowest latency, how much do you cache in the cloud? How much do you cache on that specific device where you want to reach? Because you have to aggregate continuous telemetry from various devices running on that autonomous card. So I would say aggregation and the pipe that goes to a location where you're aggregating all that information that you need to make decision and to be offloaded onto edge versus the decision of what needs to stay on the device. So those capabilities of how fast do you deliver that data and information, which I think Dan mentioned, like amount of data that you deliver, and then what data do you process, how fast, and how do you bring it back so that you're alerted, you're informed, you're able to make a decision because it's a life-threatening decision right on there. So data processing is really important. What kind of data do you process? And in those cases, the technologies or even the infrastructure technology, whether it will be bare metal, whether it will be or just a VM, like gigantic VM sitting in a place would also be important.
Okay, so that's a good point. I mean, you mentioned about like some real-time requirements and also around the devices. I know Intel has been synonymous with like CPUs for a long time, but I think you guys do a lot more than that now, right? And when it comes to the IoT, what kind of architecture, what kind of best practices are you seeing being deployed out there? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Dan, Clint, and Lakshmi, I think they all touched on, the very critical aspects, right? But then, getting back to the question of how do you architect for success, right, in the edge? I think the notion which you put forth initially, Patrick, right, in the sense that edge means different things for different people, right? Edge means something for discrete manufacturing. Edge means something for the space Clinton is on, oil and gas or process manufacturing, as we generally, talk, and medical and, vehicle to vehicle communication. I think the key is for us as architects is to basically understand the scope of the segment which we are addressing, with the for the edge, right? And then deliver, an architecture that is relevant for that particular segment, right? And from a CPU space, and we are actually extending into XPUs right now, which includes accelerators, FPGAs, and other things like that. It is a combination of how these come together to basically address a problem, right? There are definitely discrete manufacturing. I think Lakshmi touched on it, where real time is very, very critical, right? Whereas process manufacturing, it is life-threatening, right? If you don't shut down a valve, in a particular amount of time, it could be life-threatening. So architecting using the technologies that are already there, assembling the technologies in a way that they address the problem, right, for that particular segment is actually going to be very, very critical for success of the architecture, right, in that space. And one last point I'll make, and then I'll stop there, is the we don't want to create a new developer paradigm for the edge, right? So we want to leverage as much as the cloud technologies that are already there, the familiarity of the developers that are already there in the cloud. If you bring it directly onto the edge platforms, then the ramp of edge technologies is much more faster instead of creating. And I think that's already happening, right? I think that's the reason why virtualization and containers, Dockers, and all are becoming very popular. And from Intel's perspective, the one last thing we are thinking is reducing the complexity. I think Dan, touched about the scale at which this is going to happen, right? Especially if we are very successful in this edge space, and that scale has to like it cannot, linearly also accompany complexity, right? So we have workload consolidation and other aspects, which basically tries to reduce the complexity of the whole end-to-end solution.
Well,
No,
just Padraig, if you don't mind, I want very point that these two just talked about, both Clinton and BK, right? So when we talk about scale, right, and be able to manage these devices at scale, don't forget that consolidation, do more with less easily, right? Simplify their edges, to help them produce the outcomes that they're looking for, right, so that they can operate their businesses. You have to take a look at, with respect to scale, you also have to take a look at the application modernization and how applications get delivered today. So it's not just, not only are you modernizing your application to deliver it in the form of a container-based application, ultimately a cloud-native microservices-based application, but the tools, right, and the way that people develop at scale, right, with CI/CD flows, right, and being able to bulk deploy and to push to production these workloads. Containerization, CI/CD workflow enables that, so we can really deliver on the promise of IoT. So that you really need to understand too, and that's important, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the aspect of that though is what we see in oil and gas and from our customers and things is like, it's almost that they want to be assured that the containers are secure, right? I mean, so we actually get into a place where we provide a market of containers that you can deploy into things, but in order to be on that market, I mean, there's a significant review of that container. It's like, what's it doing? What's it connecting to? Is it white source and security scans which go over that thing before it's actually added into it, so that you can use it. So you may get a faster development speed that says, yes, I can build up to a certain point using CI/CD, but when you get down to in these sort of critical assets, where the assets are so expensive and in such a critical environment, that assurance really has to kind of come with the product, that says, you're not just going to randomly install anything you want to on the edge. It's just not going to happen, right? I mean, you're going to say, this has definitely been commissioned and provisioned not properly, but for this type of environment. And I think that goes down to what kind of VK was saying, is like for the environment that you're in, you really have to architect and say, these are the real considerations you got to take into account when you're developing that architecture, and those sort of implications that drive you to saying, okay, I have private registry, security staff in place and things like that, which is really relevant for our area.
The security kind of winds its way through all of this, and
absolutely.
Deploying these images, you have to test them, you have to test the hardware, you have to test the images, right? So
the whole pathway. I mean, I think that like Lakshmi was talking about the pushing of the data, the container, the data pathway all the way from the edge to whichever cloud or something that you're going to go into. Getting IT involved and saying, how do you secure at every little point along the way?
That's an interesting point, actually. Actually, curious to get your perspective on this, right? So we have the IT world and the data centers where they are a standardized environment, and it's kind of a controlled environment. And now we're integrating with the edge world, right, which is a little bit messy, a little less control, and what we're doing a lot more diverse, right? What kind of best practices do we take from what we've accumulated and refined over the last few years in the cloud and apply them to the edge? I mean, there's certain things, so as to take VK's point, not to reinvent the wheel everywhere.
Yeah. So two parts, I would say. One is kind of deployment side, and then I think because the previous conversation was about security, and I was also kind of extending that to operation side. So the best practices that we can leverage from cloud world is like we have understood, right, and we have learned how to operationalize at scale, right? So because building part of customers kind of building and deploying and modernizing their application, they still have their own tools while they use our APIs and our platform, but they would like that diversity and then flexibility of choosing their own models of how they build, what kind of say, even from containerization perspective, for a long time, we had to offer both open source version of one container technology to second container technology to the managed version that we offer in cloud. So customers do. So what we have learned, right, over time is how to operationalize a large environment. And then also in operationalizing that, something that is coming up more and more, especially for, say, diverse environment, as we are talking about, where each of the interesting scenario with edge is that, like, and is that each use case within an industry also requires a different kind of operationalization, right? So that is mind-boggling, right? So even the security principles and how even how you monitor your own system within, and say, an oil and gas environment, right? And while that fits into a weather, like, and you would assume that this is kind of similar to how you would do for a weather company or something. They are not, because their practices are different, people are different, right? So what we are trying to do is that, hey, we have understood that how to operationalize at scale, right? Applications at scales, VM at scales, like containers at scale. And then we have also understood that what capabilities should you deploy at edge, for example, distributed CDN, distributed DNS, right? So distributed load balancers. So and then we are taking those principles of learning that what makes sense at the edge and how do you operationalize that. And the most important part that is coming more and more is that my day to ops, because we all can work together to say, hey, let's modernize and bring it somewhere and make it hybrid, because I'll keep some control on prem and I'll deploy something in cloud. But the conversation where we have the most amount of conversation is that, yes, I did it once, but now it's all done. What is my day to ops? What does that mean, right? So that means, hi, hey, I have a device upgrade on prem, and now I have a virtual version of the device and the virtual version of the CPU and core in cloud. Is it the same patch that goes in both, right? So we are actually, I think that to me is that we are learning, we have learned slowly, but from a challenge perspective, that is one of those challenges, the day two part. Day one, I think for some industries, some use cases, we are kind of learning and getting there, like, crawl, walk kind of thing. But day two is where we are trying to kind of get to.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a good segue. Sorry. So okay, it's a good segue to the other thing I've noticed. Right, again, my time spent in this space is that there's a convergence happening here, right, where we're bringing the IT infrastructure and skills and people, and we're starting to marry them with the operational people. And they all have slightly different perspectives on the world, right? And Clinton, I'm curious from your perspective, right? When the two come together, like what's overlooked, right? I think Lakshmi made a good point. There are a lot of different environmental variables that are not necessarily things that IT and working in the cloud we would be aware of when we start to do things in the field. I'm curious from your perspective, what kind of challenges you see? What are the gaps?
Well, I mean, it's almost like it's like a mini IT world, right? So you're basically at the edge, right? So yeah, and I think you really have to, in areas where, I mean, literally there's a pole sitting beside a wellhead, and it's visible from a road, and then you're going to attach an IoT device to it with an antenna on it, and it's like, if I was going to attack some company someplace, I'd start hitting there, right? I mean, it's like, let's see if it's secure. Let's grab the cards out of it, in order to the communication cards, and then start tearing that things apart. So, IT has a lot to bring to the table there when they go, okay, well, how are you going to protect this thing, right? I mean, IT has considerable experience on how to manage this, what kind of security scans are being done on the edge, what are you leaving open, and a lot of things that can bring in terms of affecting the development of any of these devices or containers, or and how you're handling data transmissions and things like that. And I know that one case that we had was basically how to hook a cellular provider into the system, and if it wouldn't have been for IT to come along and really help us through that piece, I think we would have done it wrong. And in those cases, it actually sort of, I don't know, it's kind of too complex to explain, but it basically, the way the packets move through the system out of the APN and into the cloud, into Google's cloud, actually there was a lot of work done with our IT group in order to manage that. So I don't think it's exclusive, and I think if you leave them out, I think it's a mistake. You really have to one, calm their fears, and then leverage their knowledge, right? So and I think those two together are really, really helpful. So.
Yeah, I have a interesting perspective on this. I think Clinton touched on the critical aspects, but one thing about this whole merging of IT and OT, or even not only merging, the interdependencies that the edge transformation is creating, right? If you take the Industrial 4.0 revolution, that is also an edge transformation that is happening specific to that segment. That presents a lot of interesting challenges, right? So for one, from a perspective of what happened before, these OTs were islands, right? I mean, yes, they had networking and other things like that, but they never, or very rarely, they would actually seamlessly integrate and blend with the IT, right, infrastructure. But with the edge transformation that is happening, that is very critical. I mean, there is no existence of an Industrial 4.0 or an edge transformation with all these cloud native technologies without the participation of IT, right, in that. So I think there is always this perspective, or I would say what we have observed, and I'm not speaking for everybody on this panel, but generally what we have observed is that there is a little bit of a friction there, conflict there, right? What takes priority, what takes precedence, even from a security perspective. And I'll give one example, and then maybe have Daniel, Lakshmi, or Clinton elaborate on that. One thing we have found is if you look at how container technologies, Dockers, and other things evolved, they were always orchestrating into a cloud, which was a secure premise by the definition of being a data center or a cloud or anything. Now we have taken that same technologies and we are orchestrating into edge devices where there is no uniformity in terms of either security or the connectivity or anything. These are devices that are diverse, that are spread across oil fields to retail shop floors, etc. And now the security takes on a different connotation with different perspective, right? Like I think Clinton was saying, in a data center, you probably can physically enforce that nobody takes a USB drive and plugs it into this and has their own malicious software that is running. But that's very, very difficult, right? In the thing. So security also has to be thought about. IT perspective of security is one angle, but then there is an OT perspective of security, which is also a lot more. And I think we have to sort of merge this and combine here.
Curious to take up, and Dan, curious to get your thoughts. I mean, one of the challenges of security that we see, right, is that security in some ways means trying to lock down the devices at the edge so that you're limited what you can do, right? But you can try and control everything from the internet, but some of these devices are not always connected to the internet, right? So how do you deal with the compromise between the ideal world and the real world, which operational people live in?
Yeah, Daniel or Clinton, do you want to take a shot at the question?
So we don't take. I think in our environment, it's really hard to say. Well, you go out and you look through a catalog of many vendors, and you go, oh, let's choose this device, and we'll take that and deploy it on the edge, put it in a box, and it's ready to go. It's not. I mean, it's like, okay, let's look at the BIOS. Let's modify the BIOS, lock down the BIOS, and how are you going to manage the entire boot sequence so you can't violate it? Okay, and then TPM, how are you going to do all of your key management, all the security management there to make sure that's not been violated, that the BIOS checks itself, and then you just start. You have to just lock it down. I mean, every port on the device as well as you can to make sure that it's not being violated. There's even has somebody gone out there and literally opened the case of the box? If it does that, the thing starts panicking, right? It says like, okay, I wasn't expected to, and he said nobody was supposed to be here to work on me today. What's wrong? And it sends alarms, as soon as you try to do those type of things.
Yeah,
so, there's a lot of considerations like that. Yeah, that really have to make.
Yeah, let me jump in here. You really need to over-rotate on security at the edge. I know for Dell, right? We cannot rely or apply IT best practices for security at the edge, right? We simply can't do that, right? I think somebody had mentioned it here that you can bypass a lot of the security things, especially around physical security, where these devices, IoT gateways and other devices are delivered outside the walls of an IT data center. And a lot of times they're in a remote site and they need to be managed remotely. They can't be managed from the cloud, right?
Right.
So you really need to really lock everything down. Everything from physical security, network security, application security, management security, deployment security. So, for example, and this ties into operational, techniques that you're using too, right? Because these are remote locations. So, one thing that I thought Intel, started a long time ago was the concept of secure device onboarding, right? So that concept, is very applicable. You're not going to find secure device onboarding in an IT data center, right? Nor, if you're going to try to provide just bare metal provisioning, at the edge, that doesn't work well either because, you have people that are deployed on site. If something goes wrong, you can't send somebody out there, right? And so, you're limited by the people that are there that can operate on this, right? So, secure over the air updates, right? There's a lot of work going on there. Going back to the, tamper security and things like that, right? Detecting if something got changed. I think I read an article, and I can't recall which article it was, but somebody was saying, I read an article that said 40% of all security breaches, at the far edge are usually through a USB port where somebody's, loading malicious code or accessing the system, right? So physical port security is extremely important, right? These are all things you don't have to worry about in an IT data center. But if you're deploying at a remote location where somebody can take that device and move it to another room and manipulate the device and compromise the system, the footprint or the attack surface, at the edge is much greater than it is in an IT data center. So you really need to over-rotate, right? So.
No, and that's precisely some of the technologies Intel is working on, to reduce the attack surface all the way at a physical port level, even not exposing certain ports, out there. And then in the oil and gas, and they are not always connected either, right? So there are examples in the oil and gas industry, like what Clinton said, where they're probably, in fact, we have had examples where a truck will drive by to the location and then establish a connectivity or Wi-Fi connectivity with that, download the data, and then make sure some management happens. So you will have to accommodate that extreme case also, where you cannot always, I think like what Dan said, you cannot always expect manageability from the remote, right? Always connected model to exist also. So yeah, including secure onboarding, I think we have been doing a lot of things along that line, and we got to do more, right? So,
no, I agree. I think you're right. I think it's a whole different world in every sense of it. And security will always be number one, right? Because what we've seen is that you will not get to deploy anything outside of the lab unless you can convince people around the security story, right? It's got to be watertight in this day.
Yeah, but even managing those devices from like a multi-tenant SaaS-based application, right? You have to worry about, can one tenant see another tenant's information? So cryptographic network isolation and things like that become very relevant and important as well.
You mentioned about like stuff of being ensuring remote boots. Data has to be encrypted at rest. It's got to be encrypted in transit back to the cloud. All these things are table stakes now, right? In the edge, so it doesn't go. So shifting gears before we run out of time, actually, I think one of the things we know that there's a lot of work, a lot of blocking and tackling has to be done to be able to deploy these solutions at the edge. But then again, one of the interesting things about this space is that there's a ton of space for innovation, right? So when you think about like, I read all these comments about there's going to be a ton of innovation at the edge. That's where all the exciting applications are going to be built over the next few years. But what are the technologies that are going to help drive some of that innovation, right? I mean, in my own mind, I think of things like mesh networks, which were, in some ways you can now start applying to industrial floors or to other remote locations. Think of things like federated machine learning, which has a way of allowing you to do machine learning at the edge without requiring a lot of data to be brought back. Then you have security orchestration. But I mean, the caveat to all this, right, is that the edge is where I think technology meets the real world solutions, be that in healthcare, be that in an oil rig, be that in an industrial solution or retail, right? So all this innovation technology has to work really well. So what are the things we can bring from technology perspective that will be accepted by these folks, right? I'm curious, Lakshmi, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I did want to kind of touch upon the previous conversation, and then
absolutely, please do. Yeah.
So I think it was interesting, this IT versus OT conversation that was going on. So maybe having been in like cloud world, like they're both same because you're basically operationalizing an IT, and then my role has been in fact like Google wide networking. So I have led like platform, hardware, software, cloud networking, edge networking, POPs, you name it. So I think so. Having been in this role for like say close to 4 years, then that kind of boundary start to blur. And since we have manufactured our own devices and everything, so it was interesting for me to kind of go back a little bit back in my career and then hear how you all were kind of talking about. So one of the things, even from a cloud perspective, like we are like, hearing and doing, is that the notion that you were saying disconnected, right? So customers who come for cloud edge use cases, and our edge, platform is called Google Edge Cloud. We do hear that, hey, we want a disconnected version. We want a version where Google doesn't control any API, and we use our own tools and things so that we have full control. So while the platform and the network interface card and CPUs and everything leverages entire in-depth security from the cloud perspective, but we are asked to do disconnected model, especially like when you come to these use cases. So yeah, we are doing both. So coming back to so can you please repeat the question? I'm sorry, I was
just what kind of technologies can we bring to bear to make the because at the end of the day, right, technology is only valuable when we can bring value to a business, right, and help increase the ROI of a business, right? So what kind of technologies do we think we can actually start to leverage at the edge that will help businesses be more efficient?
So since I'm a product person, I always think from like what my customers are asking, and I would say, to be honest, like customers talk about security all the time, like how you all were talking. That's why I went into a lot of reads in my head that what my customers are saying. So it starts from like, hey, even before we say anything, they're like, hey, I'm in I'm in financial. All the financials are not yet so much into this space, but we hear from them. But typically it starts from telcos coming in and saying that 5G use cases, and then what they want is that, can I have my OSS BSS system managing all devices everywhere from cloud, whatever, right? And then for that, what we need to do is that, how do I interface, right? How do I build common set of APIs to integrate into their existing third-party, very old archaic systems? So that's the technology that is important to them, because they are very, tightly bound by the regulations of every country, and those regulations are becoming worse and worse. So the data, how do we make sure for those use cases that the data stays where it is, and we are complying to all the compliance and regulations for those workloads sitting on those edges, which is typically base stations, closer to the base stations. So the security and more of compliance, right? So that compliance is managed, data at residency is managed, and then we can still, giving the newer tools, integrate into their existing OSS BSS systems. So that's kind of one category of customers. So technology, how do you do that? How do you bring that into the smaller form factors which are sitting right next to the tower? So that's kind of one technology. How do you streamline, or say reduce the whole cloud kind of factor, bring all the applications of big queries and data migrations and VM instance type, everything that you have, and then you still fit into the small form factor, and you can still be integrated into their system, and you can still comply to the regulations of not distributed cloud, but to the country that they are regulating in. So for us, security, regulation, being able to integrate into existing systems so that they can continue to manage as if nothing has changed. So that those three aspects is what we are dealing with, because customers come to us to get our global access, right? And how in the global world, we still give them that feeling of control. They want control with the same privacy and compliance that they are used to in a particular country.
Yeah. I think what you mentioned is a very good point, actually. The whole notion of we need to preserve the legacy work that has been done as we bring the IT to the edge, right? There's a lot of applications, a lot of work that they've built on top of over the last few years that we need to preserve, as you just mentioned. DK, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, actually.
I think Lakshmi touched on that critical aspects, right? But generally, what I view this is, especially as the edge proliferates and then scales, like what Daniel had initially indicated, given us a sense of what the scaling complexity is. I think any technology that goes into reducing TCO, total cost of ownership, or reducing the operational expense, right? When the edge, transforms, or when the transformation to the edge completes, that is very critical. Be it in the form of 5G connectivity, be it in the form of, enhancements to security. At the end of the day, when an IT or an OT manager makes the decision, how to use his check, I think the total cost of ownership plays a big factor, right? If we do all technologies, but it, with the amount of scale, what Dan spoke about in the thing, if also the TCO scales, right, the ownership cost exponentially explodes, I don't think these technologies are going to matter, right? So I think, Clinton probably knows this very well in the oil and gas industry. I think there is already a notion that things are working, right? So unless there is a additional benefit of reducing the TCO with whatever technology we introduce, or reduce operational expenses, right? CapEx is different. I think CapEx, they are willing to spend to some extent, but in the long run, I think they want these benefits. And instead of going into specific technologies, which I think Lakshmi has spoken, and Dan and Clinton will also touch, I'm just going to say that any technology in the edge which is leading towards OpEx reduction or TCO, bringing down the TCO, is going to be very beneficial.
Yeah, I'd like to second that, right? So any customer that we've ever dealt with, or any customer or system I've designed for customers, in my career, have always done more with less and done it easily, right? They're really looking to save on CapEx and OpEx. It's no different than your smartphone, right? Look at the evolution of that, right? So there's a lot of technologies out there, especially at the edge and the growth of data, mostly in the form of IoT, streaming data, how you manage that data. So this is what Lakshmi was talking about, right? We view at Dell, edge is a place where data is acted on close to its point of generation, right? And so how does that help the customers with their outcomes and managing their business and managing their costs, right? There's many ways that they can do that. And they are all challenges that you have to address when you're architecting for the edge. So data management, right? Having the ability to be able to distribute compute to where the data exists is important to reduce, egress fees or to manage bandwidth at scale, right? And to do that intelligently, and then have the ability to also manage the utilization of the CPU, compute, and networking resources so you can further manage your cost control, right? Is very important. So now you start to get into composability and adaptability and adaptive resource balancing and things like that. And so those are very critical. So these are all technology areas. We talk about GPU utilization, right? It's one thing just to assign a GPU to a guest or to a container, right? But a lot of times those applications, they're not going to be fully utilizing that GPU all the time. So you're going to have underutilized resources. So how do you then share that resource amongst a bunch of applications as a service, right? These are all the things that are very important at the edge to help them control their costs. And it affects both OpEx and CapEx.
Great, I totally agree. Clinton, as you're probably the closest to the end user, I'll let you have the last word on this topic.
Well, on a typical project, to say you're going to deploy, I think we started really looking at IoT devices, many years ago, and when you're doing the hardware selection alone, I think that was 2 years of investigation, about going to say, this is everything that has to be there. This is how the BIOS has to work. This is what the operating system has to do, and you get to that. And I think our perspective now is, and I think this is, where our Agora is trying to fit in, and maybe it's a niche area, is to say, a hardware roadmap that says, the engineering that's taken in order to establish this is a secure platform, and and making sure that architecture is taken into account, and then how you're going to secure the device, making sure that's taken into account. That this is all goes to that TCO comment that you made. That's a huge portion, and it will eat your cost. It will eat your whole project up if you try to do this from scratch anymore. I mean, you've got to really look at things that are out there and say, what can I pick up and use? What can I pick up and use, and not ever try to engineer from scratch anymore. You have to be really aware of what's on the edge. And just one last thing, and I think one of the things that's coming very quickly is these low Earth orbit satellites that are coming out there, and your connectivity being able to increase significantly. that's one thing we need to be watching, because I think where in our case, you're talking about bytes being transferred over satellites and really really heavily monitoring what's going on, that Tesla's venture into this and all these things, that can really change a lot for us. So.
Okay.
Can I just add one quick
Please.
Yeah. So like what VK talked about, like, the TCO matters, and then yes, customers, like journey to cloud has always been about like reduce my TCO, reduce my OpEx. So we get into that conversation. But the point that Dan also mentioned, that's very interesting, and that's also something as a cloud provider we always talk about and deal with, is that while you're distributing in a centralized environment, or centralized, I would say decentralized, centralized ops environment, that's what cloud is. So how do you make efficiencies, right? How do you achieve the efficiencies, and what the usage of GPUs, usage of CPUs, because they are expensive kind of units distributed on different places. So customers are still kind of, our customers like, Schlumberger, they are kind of still discussing how would it really, would the TCO be as they're thinking? Because once they start to deploy, the challenges that, Dan talked about, the utilization of these underutilized assets may also become a blocker in deployment. So that just wanted to kind of summarize that.
Yeah. I think they're all good points, actually. And just in the interest of people's time, right, because I know I don't want to, we have people, you all gratefully signed up for the last hour, and I don't want to go past the next hour, top of the hour, because I know you have other commitments. But I think for me, I just want to say thanks for all. I think the big takeaways really is, everything starts and ends with security in our business, right? And when we move to the edge, I think that hasn't changed. If anything, it's an even bigger headache. I think to Dan's point, it's a greater attack surface we need to worry about. I think the other two things, the other big thing I think really is we have to bring value, right? I think someone made a comment that, yeah, there are solutions out there today. So anything we're bringing to the edge is going to be compared against the cost and the benefits that we're going to bring for that deployment. So I think it's a great opportunity. I think we, as all of us who are working in this space, I think we have to prove our value to the customers, right? Based on what we do going forward. If we architect correctly, that will be the case. So with that, I just wanted to thank each of you for spending the time today. Actually, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your insights and your background, etc. And I wish everyone well in their respective fields and companies. And hopefully we get to touch base again over the next few months and years in this space. And hopefully it'll be a good
situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
It was an honor to share the platform with all of you. Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.